Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our post-screening panel discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to just acknowledge a few offices who helped make this possible. First, the Melba Program in Western American Studies, who graciously funded our screening. The Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the Philosophy Departments, who helped fund our guest panelist, Dr. Lewis. And then also our co-sponsors, the biology, communications, history, philosophy, sociology departments at Calvin University. And I also have to give a shout out to Jenna Hunt and Jane Bruin for doing a lot of legwork and publicizing and helping get us organized. And a big thank you to Nate, Porter, and Sydney this evening for helping us out on the tech side of things. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. To our attendees, I just wanted to make a comment about your own participation, which we welcome and invite. To contribute or ask a question or make a comment, please use the chat feature on WebEx. And if you could, make sure it's being sent to everyone. That way I can moderate that and make sure your questions are asked of the panelists. So I'd like to begin then with a brief introduction of our distinguished panel, and then I'm going to ask them for their initial response to the film, what the film left them thinking. So we're going to begin with Dr. Geert Heetebrai, who has a Master of Fine Arts from the University of California in film. Dr. Heetebrei's area of expertise is screenwriting, story structure, and filmmaking. So I'm going to ask Dr. Heetebrai if he would first share his initial reactions and responses to the documentary. Dr. Heetebrai. Yeah.
You can call me Master. I do have an MFA. Well, I thought it was really interesting how this was originally approached because it kind of reminded me of Inconvenient Truth in the sense that the spine of the documentary was a lecture, and this was a series of lectures. It started with a slideshow to an audience that were introduced to it for the first time, and then a number of people were lectured throughout. And the lectures just kept coming. They went from slideshows to lectures to kids to the science, fair lecture. And there was one instance, actually two, where one of the people featured were speaking to the camera, or actually to the interviewer next to the camera. But everything else was basically making us, the viewer, a witness to things that were already going on. This was no, documentary with talking heads. This was just us getting a peek into what's going on in what seems like a small corner. But that's the power of documentary. You shine a light on that, and you can make it huge. But I was really intrigued by that visual approach to something that is not inherently visual, but they made it very much so.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Katerberg. Dr. Katerberg has a PhD from Queen's University in history. He is expert on Native American history and the North American West. He is also the director of the Melba Program in Western American Studies. So I'm going to ask Dr. Katerberg what his initial reaction is and responses to the film. Dr. Katerberg? Dr. Katerberg, we can't hear you.
I still don't hear you.
It's muted.
While we get that sorted out, Dr. Katerberg, you there? for some reason, we'll move on and come back. Shall we do that, Nate?
Yep. Dr. Caterberg, can you just click the little arrow next to your mute button and make sure you're using the right microphone and speaker settings? And while you figure that out, we can move on.
Sure. So let's hear from Dr. David Dornbos. Dr. Dornbos has a PhD from Iowa State University in crop production and physiology. I read on his page that he's an expert on the physiological basis by which non-native invasive plant species compete with native plants. So Dr. Dornbos, I'm curious to know what your initial thoughts are in responses to the film.
Yeah, my initial response was kind of made me sad to hear some of the history, but then made me kind of excited to hear about the forward-looking aspect of it. So I kind of was working with those kind of two emotions throughout. Mm-hmm. There were two quotes that I pulled out that I thought were particularly interesting. One is, recovery is changing behaviors. I don't remember who said that or where it was said, but it was recovery is changing behaviors. And my immediate thought is yes, that's appears to be true for Native American peoples, but man, is that needed by all Americans. So yeah, I think all Americans need similar sorts of recovery, and we can only achieve that by changing behaviors. The second quote was, how do you get it back to the way it should be? And the thinking I had there is we can't really go back, although we do not need to let the history teach us how to go forward better. And there are actually very exciting ways forward. And so I was really pleased to kind of hear some of this wisdom come out of Native Americans in the various places that we saw. So I found that very intriguing and mind-opening.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dornbos. Dr. Caterberg, are you with us yet? No? Okay. Our next panelist, Dr. Michelle Lloyd Page, a PhD from Purdue University in sociology. Her area of expertise is the sociology of race and racism, and she serves as the executive assistant to the president for diversity and inclusion. And I just learned before we got on this evening that she is working with her daughter in Nashville to begin a vegan blog. Is that correct, Dr. Page?
That's a blog and podcast, yes.
Yes. So curious to know, hear your initial responses to the film. And I know you weren't able to, you were having technical difficulties, so you didn't get to see the entire film. But from what you saw.
Oh yeah, I think I saw the better part of it. What struck me was the relationship between culture and food, and how much our lives revolve around food. And one of the striking visuals that I had where there was the line of food along the road, and they were talking about, this is the kind of food we're supposed to be eating, but what is the kind of food that we have been eating? And the relationship between our health and what we eat. And they were talking about the children experiencing diabetes and the adults experiencing diabetes. And it resonates with me because that's so very true, even within the African-American tradition as well, that so many diseases, so many affects on the body can be healed through food. And I was just very much appreciative of how, at least the stories that were highlighted in the documentary, that they were using food, the process of growing food, of harvesting food, of gathering food, of preparing food, to heal not only individual bodies, but to heal culture, to heal trauma as well. And I see that growing within other ethnic communities, and from my perspective, especially within the African American community, because there's a growing trend of veganism within the African American tradition is because of the impact of fast foods and eating foods that I don't think were really created to eat, right? These manufactured chemicals as opposed to food. So that's what really resonated with me from this documentary.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I too was struck by, in the opening of the film, connecting colonization and violence and genocide in attacking food in that process. Thank you. Our other panelist, guest panelist from the University of South Carolina is Dr. Courtney Lewis, who has her PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina. Dr. Lewis is an enrolled member in the Cherokee Nation and an expert on indigenous food sovereignty. And as I mentioned, we're so grateful that she is joining us this evening. Dr. Lewis, your initial response to the film.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say first, thank you for inviting me on this panel. It's an honor to be with all of you talking about this film that I think is going to be a very impactful film when it starts reaching out to a larger audience. So thank you for the invitation here, and thank you to Dr. Haltman as well for reaching out. When I first saw this film coming from an American Indian perspective, it really brings into sharp relief for me the difference in the conceptualization of not only what food means, but in a worldview between many American Indians and settler colonial society. So it means seeing a world in terms of an abundance economy instead of an artificial economy of scarcity that we normally see. It means seeing food not as a product of factory or having a goal of moving towards a just-in-time industrialization, but food that is by and for community.
Yes, and that, thank you, Dr. Lewis. That reminds me of something that stood out in the film for me as well, is in Dr. Lloyd Page, you hit on this as well, is the interconnectedness that came over and over again in the film of how food sovereignty and food is more than just the physical, that there is healing not only in the physical body, but also the spiritual. So you have the connection between the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional, the mental. There's healing that comes in. All of that's holistic. Really struck me as a theme that you heard over and over again. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Caterberger, you available? Nate, have we?
I believe he's disconnecting and trying to join back in. So, yep.
All right. So I'm going to now open it to the panelists. And on that last point that Dr. Lewis shared, I'm curious if panelists would like to comment on what you, from your viewing, what you thought the central message or messages were of the film, and how effective the director and producers were in communicating those messages out to the audience. What were you struck by as the primary takeaways and messages of this film?
Yeah, I'll jump in. One of the quotes that I have is that we are not transforming food, food is transforming us. And I think we can see that in multiple ways, whether we're looking at the consumerism that we see in the United States, where it's fast food, it is food that is not necessarily good for the body, but it's convenient, it's fast, it's full of fat and salt that just tingles the taste buds so that it has that kind of taste, so it's supposed to taste good. It does great harm to the environment. And so we can be transformed by the food in our ways. So that's something that I really took away and resonated with, right? So that we are not transforming the food, but the food is transforming us. So if we do it naturally in the old ways that was really sustainable, then we can see how it is transforming us to be a healthier community. But when we get into the factory farming, when we get into these mega agricultural corporations that are producing food, and then we don't have access to the seeds to actually grow the food, then we are too being transformed by the food, but not in a healthy way. So that's something that really struck me, because I could see it in multiple ways, that food can allow us to be healthy, or food can allow us to go down a path that's hard to recover from.
Yeah, and I think there was such a striking way depicted in the transformation of the gas station into the cafe, and what was being offered in the gas station to what's now being offered in the cafe. Anyone want to add to that or comment on that? Geert?
Yeah, just it was, getting a new life. There was also a lot of like new generation teaching, right? I mean, there was in the beginning it opened in that golden, yellow light of this. I forget what her name is, but the older woman who's teaching May, the one who came from a broken family, and that's also how the film ended. So it was kind of bracketed by those two, but in between you saw a lot of generational teaching. There was that pair of an elder teaching the young, and there was the pair of the Dubrays, right? She is now at Stanford University, and there was also the generational teaching, even though there's no generational gap between them, but between the kind of 20-somethings from Northern California and then younger kids, but very much like handing the stick over to the new generation. It's not the stick, but like, how do you call it? But yeah, very interesting. That very much a motif, the generational teaching, and climaxing in the remaking of that kitchen where everything comes together.
Yes, thank you, Geert.
At the very end, I thought it was interesting when the young man from the Yurok Nation talked about how the industrial age has ended. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was an important point. I kind of wished, the film might hit that a little harder, not towards the end, so it's kind of alluding to it throughout the film. Mm-hmm. I think he's right, but I'm not sure most of agriculture understands it yet, because agriculture, as it currently operates, is very much industrialized. And all the motors seem to be kind of pointing it in that direction. Now, it's completely unsustainable from an environmental point of view. I mean, Stephen, you talked about holism. And so, yes, it's good for people. It's good for, kind of the emotional, the spiritual well-being of people. It's also good for the environment, because how we produce food today is inherently unsustainable.
Mm-hmm. I think the transition from the gas station, which is representing something that's inherently unsustainable, especially more so now, into something that is sustainable, was a not so subtle kind of cue as to what was going on there. And for me, a lot of the themes of this film revolve around resiliency, right? So these are practices that weren't gone. They were there. Mm-hmm. But being able to legally and publicly practice them was something that had to be overcome. So being resilient enough to carry these practices through to a point where they can actually be practiced in a sustainable way without being arrested really speaks to the resiliency of Indigenous people in general. The other thing that strikes me about this film is that for many films, And for many portrayals of American Indian, it's very much of the past, right? So this film puts what's going on with the food sovereignty movement firmly in place today. And it's not looking at the past, it's looking towards the future. So American Indians being put forward as in their place of modernity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Will, were you commenting or had a comment on that?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, very good. Well, I've already said everything I want to say, so. Sure. So my first thought with the movie, I'm a historian, so I'll speak from that point of view, was that many people think of indigenous peoples as peoples without history. It's actually the name of a book. And as I was watching, I was thinking of maps of the evolution of food cultures, in the hundreds and thousands of years of Native American history, long before Europeans arrived. And then thinking about how foodways changed. So for example, when horses arrived on the Great Plains in the 1600s, then how foodways changed again when Native peoples suffered conquest and were forced onto reservations. And now they're changing again. And just the very long history of foodways, both the creative moments and the traumatic moments. And then the other thought that I had was the film is a really marvelous example of the evolution of traditions in new contexts. And so I see Native peoples working with local foods and yet all sorts of modern hardware and equipment and kitchen stuff, and traditional foodways blending with very contemporary, the kind of stuff you'd expect from a chef who's worked in fancy restaurants in terms of presentation. And, so there's something delightful about the creative adaptation of traditional cultures in new contexts. And I guess those were the two things that struck me. How living traditions are always evolving, whether they're evolving in moments of creativity or moments of trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Caterberg. We have a series of really insightful questions here I'd like to share. I want to get to those. So to the panelists, this comes from Professor Kalama in social work. His entire classes viewed the film and is now participating in our panel. And here they read a piece by a Lakota social worker, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, about historical trauma. Excuse me, I have to go back. About historical trauma in preparing for tonight's screening. Dr. Kalama wonders if the panel could reflect a bit on historical trauma and community healing, which Dr. Caterberg, you were just talking a bit about that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the panelists would share some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I have a very quick thought to pick up on mine, which is so many of the stories that were told by people who'd fallen into addiction or just poor health because of poor food, that the transformation they've experienced and that they've worked towards has not been one of subtraction, stopping doing something that was unhealthy, but it's more been one of addiction, adding things to their lives that are part of their deep roots. And so recovery from trauma, part of the story is finding back or finding anew, sustaining things. And it strikes me that food is so powerful because it's connected to physical health, to spiritual health, to community rituals, liturgies, I think is maybe even a better term. And I can't imagine but that it resonates across communities and cultures.
So my dad was actually the first American Indian with a PhD in social work. So this question speaks to me. I definitely grew up in a social work world, American Indian centric social work world, which is very unusual. And for me, when we talk about things, even in a social work context, especially, and I'm looking at your question now, between historical trauma and community healing, there's no one solution, but there is one thing that will help a lot of the solutions, and that is Native nation sovereignty and Native nation autonomy. So Native nations need to be able to have their sovereignty established. They need to be able to have autonomy over all aspects of their community. So everything from being able to instill restorative justice projects instead of participating in the prison industrial complex, to food systems, which, as we were just talking about, connect with everything. So food isn't just about the body. Food is about language, right? When we reclaim our food systems, we reclaim our language. When we reclaim food, we reclaim religion. When we reclaim food, there's economic resiliency. There's mental health wellness, all attached to it. And these all go back to the ability of Native nations to protect and sustain their sovereignty.
Another.
Go
ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to, and then just a quick note on that. Thank you, Dr. Lewis. That struck me how the directors and producers chose to open the film with the quote from Crazy Horse, "The Red Nation will rise again," and that idea of sovereignty, as you put it. Master Heidbrei, you were going to say something.
That was a joke, Master. But anyway, I was also struck in the context of this question that was just asked about overcoming trauma as a community, about the power of story. And what this film does is reframing the narrative, because the original narrative that even they grew up with was that the savages were overcome, and then they were civilized, right? Or they were being civilized in their schools, and that is completely kind of cast away in this film, and it just reframes the narrative. Starts with like it's created, the reality that's created, like I said, in that golden light in the beginning, and then the inciting incident of this film, of this story, would be the conquest and the taking away of indigenous sovereignty through the destruction of the food sources. And therefore, the rest of the film then kind of builds towards and ends in that kitchen of reclaiming food sovereignty. And the power of film is, you can film something, and that you can make it the eye of the whole world if this documentary is big enough, and you can make something that was small very large. So yeah, the power of story, framing narrative, I think, is very powerful in overcoming trauma.
Yeah, and I would add that when we're looking at historical trauma, it's the cumulative effect, right? It's not just what happened 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 500 years ago. It's not just what happened back then. It's what happens back then, and then how that is impacted or built upon through systemic racism, through policies and everything. And so the whole thing, the cultural genocide that takes away one's identity. So if you have thought of yourself as a people, and then everything around you is telling you that you aren't anything, it's almost surprising that anyone survives, that anyone is not abusing drugs or can recover from using drugs, from trying to escape, because everything around you, if you're placed in on the reservations or on the res where it's hard to find things that are flourishing unless you're intentional to reclaim those things that are flourishing. So in that changing of the narrative, it's reclaiming identity, it's reclaiming self. So it's not just the sovereignty of the land or food sovereignty or able to govern, but even reclaiming who you are, and your value as individuals. And so that community healing comes about in reclaiming of identity of individuals collectively to say, no, we matter, we are important, and we will survive. So that's what I see with the historical trauma. It's just the cumulative effect that adds onto it, and then it gets compounded with the systemic racism. So you have poor health, and then you don't have access to health care in order to remedy the poor health that you are experiencing.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lloyd Page. And that actually connects to another question that a panelist asked, and that is, in what ways do you see depicted in the film, in the ways in which religion and spirituality plays a role in that transformation and healing? The question is, any thoughts on the panelists on the influence of spirituality and religion in the transformation and maturation of this new revitalization of American Indian foodways and culture? And the follow-up to that was, do you think this bolsters that revitalization or acts as a possible weaker point in fighting for a wider knowledge and acceptance of this newer identity? From one of the panelists.
Religion gives us our meanings for life and ways of understanding who we are and our place in the world and the universe. And so when there's an acceptance of spirituality, a reclaiming of it, that it's not demonic, that it's acceptable. I mean, and when we look at how Christianity has tried to get rid of indigenous spirituality, so a reclaiming of it, I think, is vital for restoring of community and self and sovereignty.
Yeah, we've been talking in class quite a bit about the weaponization of Christianity, of white Christianity in particular. Yep. Other thoughts from the panel on that question? Thank you, Dr. Lloyd Page. Any other thoughts from the panelists on that question?
Well, I think it's also important to remember that for many Native nations and American Indians, there is no separation between these concepts. So the idea that religion isn't enmeshed in all of this would be very foreign. The idea that, and here there was actually, if you look at the film, there was some actual extra footage that I was able to look at as well. And in it, they talk about the kind of tyranny of pronouns. And by this, I mean that for Western society, we refer to, or they refer to plants as it, right? And what does this do to our perspectives on cutting down a tree, ripping up a garden? When you have to refer to the corn as she, how does that change your interaction with that, right? How does this change our relationship to food and to land? So for many Native nations and American Indians, there really isn't this separation.
Yeah, that point was made throughout the film. Thank you, Dr. Lewis. And one moment that for me really stood out was when the Ancestral Guard, the Yurok Ancestral Guard, the youth were bringing a young Yurok boy to fish and to acknowledge the seals. And if you see people shooting at the seals, you say something. Mm-hmm. That recognition, that's spiritual. It's not. It's all intertwined. It's not separated out as these different categories of existence, but all intertwined. Dr. Dornbus, anything you wanted to add on that question, coming off of what Dr. Lewis said about plants and viewing plants and thinking about plants as it versus.
Yeah, I think names are important, and we can actually touch into Will's question there too. So I think having a close relationship with the land, which was given to us by God, is critically important, and that shapes how we use that land. what food we grow, how we harvest what we grow, what we harvest to eat, all of that. And so I think, well, I guess what I wonder about is how we should, as maybe white Christians, view a book in the Bible like Leviticus, where there are rules given to the Israelite nation about how we should treat land. 7 years and a rest. And we don't do that. So I understand how Native Americans are looking at this as being highly intertwined, and I suspect all Christians should be looking at it this same sort of way. Genesis 2:15 is all about, to use and to serve and protect, or to use and take care of. It's the dual command. It's the stewardship command. So yes, use the land, harvest food, collect food, grow food. But the other command is to take care of. And those two commands are connected by the word and. So you don't have the option, actually, as a Christian, to grow food in such a way that destroys the environment. I mean, we shouldn't have that option. And so I don't know why we don't take, that stewardship command more seriously. I think we ought to. I think we've got something to learn from our Native American brothers and sisters.
The panelists that want to jump in on that. There's a question that I think comes from Joseph Kemp House in New Mexico, where the film ends. And I think for those who aren't familiar, the question Joseph asked, what is the true Thanksgiving story? Where the film ends there. That's something in both Native American history and in the U.S. history course I teach. The U.S. history students read a book called Lies, My Teacher Told Me, in which sociologist James Lowen talks about the first Thanksgiving story as a lie. And that's the director and producers are getting at that very thing. But the question from Joseph is, well, what is that story? Why is the director and the producers bringing that up at the end here? But that's a lie. What's the lie, in other words? Joseph wants to know. Anyone on the panel want to take that?
I won't go into the details too much, seeing as how I have to deal with Columbus in a few days.
Yeah.
If you want to know the actual story of the declaration of the first Thanksgiving by a government figure, I do recommend Googling the Pequot Massacre of 1627. And they gave thanks for attacking and massacring an entire Pequot village. So I recommend Googling that. It is very graphic. The descriptions from the time from people who watched it are very graphic. So do be aware of that.
And to those of you attending who are of the Dutch Reformed tradition, the Dutch in New Nederland hired John Underhill, who is the English captain who led that massacre, to conduct a massacre of Lenni Lenape peoples who had actually come south to New Amsterdam for protection and instead were massacred by the Dutch Reformed people of New Amsterdam. Thank you, Dr. Lewis. And that actually connects then to a question that comes from someone in the Native American history class who I just spoke with this afternoon. She's a senior and wants to go into law and is really interested in going into indigenous rights in terms of the law in return to her native Hawaii. And so she asks you a question about genocide. I have to scroll up to find it again. Oh, I went too far up. There it is. So she would like to know, the film talked about how Native Americans are still living out ancestral genocide, even in ways we might not originally consider, like lack of food sovereignty, which is something Dr. Lewis pointed out. The question is, how might individuals, organizations, and even government agencies start to provide reparations for factors such as this?
So I can speak to, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but there is a very important element of this that actually ties in with the film. So this film was put together by the First Nations Development Institute, which was also funded with the Native American Agricultural Fund. Now, the important thing about this is that that fund was set up as a result of a court case, 1999 Keith Siegel versus Vilsack. It was a class action lawsuit alleging that the United States Department of Agriculture had engaged in systematic discrimination against Native American farmers and ranchers in their loan programs dating back to at least 1981. And they won the suit. There was a settlement, actually. I should bring that in. There was an original settlement that resulted in about a $680 million compensation fund. So these are the kind of things. Okay, so step one, attack systemic racism. Right, that's the first step to reparations. Step two, honor the treaties. This is something that was just won in another court case yesterday, so I cannot remember the name of it. A California nation was just given access to their own land when the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. So again, that just happened yesterday. What went on at Standing Rock as a result of not honoring treaties. So these are really your first two steps. Address systemic racism, two, actually honoring the treaties that are in place. And then there's a whole world open, especially for Native Hawaiians. Native Hawaiians have a very, very different relationship with the government, as do Alaskan Natives. And there is a lot of movement to be made in those areas. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Anyone else on the panel want anything to add on that question?
The only thing I would add is that to get to the place that Dr. Lewis had identified, which I think is key, is that there has to be a will and a desire to do so, which means seeing this, the majority of Americans needing to see this as their issue as well. Because if you don't see it as impacting you or as your issue, you don't care and you're not motivated to act, to change, or to advocate for others. And so there has to be the will, the desire to do so, to see it as not just their problem, but it's our problem. And in a nation with the United States, having more of an individualistic value is that, we're just highly individual. It's just me, myself, and I. That becomes more difficult, but when we can decenter self and see ourselves as community and see this is our problem, and then we have the desire and the will to do so, that's when we'll begin to be able to address the systemic racism and to honor the treaties, because we'll see that this is our treaties that we have a part to play in, and not just something that was way back there and doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I appreciated how the directors and producers ended on that very note of this is a restorative revolution. It's our problem. We all need to join it. And as Geert mentioned, how the director and producers are inviting us into that. So you're welcome in. I see, unfortunately, we are about out of time. We're at 8:59. I want to thank again all of our panelists for such an engaging conversation. There's so much more we could talk about. But thank you so much for your participation. I wish you well, and to all the attendees, there are 51 attendees still with us. Thank you too for engaging in this very important conversation.
Can I end on one just one note?
Yes.
Especially after watching this film, I hope that this inspires a lot of people to start thinking about local foods, foods that are native to your area. One thing I do caution on is that when films like this come out, a lot of times non-native folks will be inspired to start foraging. And this is good to learn, but also we've had a lot of destruction of endangered plants, chaga mushrooms, ramps. These are all very, very delicate and can easily be over-harvested. So please do learn more about your local native wild forage plants, but also be very, very careful that you are not causing the kind of damage that you're looking to actually rectify. So I hope that you all can go out and learn.
Absolutely. That's a great note to end on. And to the attendees, I will be sending out a link on that very subject that Dr. Lewis just shared with us. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, and to the rest of the panel, thank you so much. I really appreciate your presence and participation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Have a good night.
Thank you.